Hey, how's it going? It's Brooks with Character Design Forge. Hope your weekend was good. We're making an experimental take, an artistic statement, if you will, on weekends and posting this on Monday mornings. So I hope your weekend was good. I'm coming to you live from the middle of a forest along with Tristan here, who is, of course, in a backpack. Say hi, Tristan. Tristan says hi. We've got two critiques for you this morning. One is a student who is looking to improve their drawing, their realism, but also their stylization as well, and is stuck in a little bit of a rut where they might be drawing a lot of things from muscle memory, if that makes sense, versus a little bit more observation, a little more constructed characters, and of course that lends itself to not having as much variety in your drawings. The other critique we're looking at, it has to do with the buildup of the torso, sort of the essential pieces of the head and the build of the torso to get a believable looking torso, and one that doesn't necessarily look like a tube, but one that looks like you can build things onto it, that it can bend and move the way that you need it to. If you'd like a critique of your own and to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/bageldenizen and get a personalized video critique of your art that helps you level up in your storytelling, your design, or your drawing, whatever you need help with. So without further ado, here's the first critique. Hey there, Mr. Moodles. How's it going? Thanks for being a patron. Thanks for being willing to do a critique here. I've got a little bit of your work together, and one of the things that you mentioned is that you primarily are looking to kind of split the difference between design and drawing critique or advice from me based on your work. So I've got a couple of things for you that I think is going to split that difference, and it sort of starts in a drawing realm, right? But it immediately affects the design, and I'll sort of show you what I mean by that. So one thing that I notice a lot in your work, generally there's a quality that you're going for that's sort of like a creepy vibe, right? Like kind of a, I guess I almost like kind of a Geiger Tim Burton type thing. I'm not like well versed enough in sort of the creepy world to put a label on it, I guess. But that's what you're sort of going for. And so there's a good quality to the lankiness, right? A character that's kind of, Slender Man-esque, that's kind of got a lot of length going on in the torso and the arms and legs and stuff like that. So obviously there's a element of that that's desirable that you're looking for, right? But one thing I kind of wanted to point out is in specifically your human anatomy, humanoid anatomy, and the construction of your head, rib cage, and pelvis. So it's not necessarily something that I think you're doing right now, because right now a lot of the bodies are kind of doing this, right? They're very simplified. Not necessarily a bean, right? Because this shape is kind of unified and it's moving in one direction. But if we get into your character here, the hotel clerk, so you see how we've got our head shape, right? And it would be good to build out a little bit. It might be there, like a little bit of a skull to her, but because it's the way we're facing, not readily apparent, I would just say, I'm not saying it's something you're doing wrong or it's not there, but make sure it is there. And if we get down sort of to our neck area, right, sort of sulking, so it's the head is low on the neck at this point. But from here, the existing placement of like the torso, right, is kind of doing this, and it's right about this area where you've kind of lost. You don't just have a skinny character, but sort of one that's detached in the middle, right? The way that our bodies work, you've got your head, you've got a spine that's doing this, right? And in between, you've got sort of a pelvis that's rotating forward, that's tilted forward like that. You've got a rib cage like this that's also tilting, or rather there's kind of a tilted flat plane at the top. So this is kind of going like that. And there's not a ton of, like, if you kind of measure on yourself, sort of a hand width between like your lowest rib and the top of that pelvis, right? There isn't much of a distance between those two, like less than a hand. And even if you kind of bend your back forward, I'm doing that now. Everyone who's watching can do that. You'll see that you still can't get too far away. So for here, if you had sort of a regular rib cage built in to your character from the beginning here, and then of course you've got like offshoots for the shoulders and stuff. So the placement of your shoulders are pretty good here. And then, you came down here and figure out, well, the legs are kind of coming off of the side of the pelvis, right? That's something that we don't really, sometimes we do this, like we kind of make Lego characters, although even Lego characters have a little T shape in the middle there. But we kind of do this thing, right, where it's like the legs are jutting out the bottom of a torso, but they're actually kind of mounted on the side there with the pelvis. So if your pelvis for this character was here, right, because this is where the legs start, you've got this really big gap in the middle. And because you kind of don't have a structure there, there's kind of just all kinds of wobbliness going on in the middle. And that's something that's kind of repeated throughout some of your work. I'm not saying that every character needs to be that in depth, but it's apparent in something like this where you're striking sort of a balance in the middle, and things are just a little bit too tall or lanky. There's definitely a way to follow this kind of 3-piece structure and make each piece, much more exaggerated, right? But I think you'll find when you kind of use these things as building blocks, you're going to get that structure that you need. And a little bit of life drawing and practice of these shapes specifically is going to help you kind of figuring out exactly how the rib cage is shaped and stuff will go a long ways there too. Just because there's so many contradictions happening across the body, right? Where there's like things pointing up, but then this is pointing down, and the arms kind of make this, or the shoulders rather, kind of make this outward shape here. So let me just make this for you real quick, show you what I mean. So generally, you're going to want to start with this head here. Make sure the skull kind of has some dimension to it, a little bit of a jaw there. And then from there, we're going to add this rib cage. And you don't need to necessarily make it this in-depth, model that you're just going to throw skin and clothes over at the end every time. But I would recommend just practicing just these pieces, right? Then you've got your pelvis that's generally, in a neutral pose is still tilted forward like this. So you're going to be able to see this top plane here. So these 3 things, and you've got your spine, the curve of the spine coming through it. And now, with this neutral positioning, okay, you understand some things, but now you can start posing and moving these 3 shapes, twisting and contorting as like expressing and acting happens, right? So that's going to be helpful for you. And from a design standpoint, that helps because you get things like even this character isn't necessarily too bad, but you see there's sort of an elevation of that shoulder that should really start about here. And like good design is going to come with better drawing, right? And I think in this case, this character turns out like a little bit better, becomes more appealing when these shapes are the right size. And you come over here and the other shoulder starts in a similar place, right? This pec kind of comes up higher, and this arm over here is longer and has larger segments, right? That's approximate. But you kind of see that the design and kind of having a flow between shapes is benefited by drawing. Another thing here too, like storytelling wise, this character you had said was a lady knight. And obviously we do a lot with subversion and stuff with characters. So there's nothing, obviously I'm not saying that this character, because she's a lady knight, needs to be like feminine looking or super noble or brave, right, as a knight. But right now, that what I sort of get from this is a sort of sense of like a beggar who has a sword, or someone who's kind of in disguise or in kind of really ratty clothes. And a lot of that has to do with sort of your stroke and texture, which is something I'm going to talk about a little bit here in a minute. But I also don't necessarily get a read of like a feminine or female character, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just not necessarily coming through. So if you're going to do something like this, bring us a little bit more information with the silhouette in the head, right? So if that means just kind of lifting the head off of the shoulders a little bit, and maybe even if we have some negative space in between before the hood, just giving us more, if that's a hood actually, I think that might just be hair. It might just be hair. So, there's kind of a way to hit that balance, right, with the hair, then the head coming in, and like a collar, not cowl, collar more. That's just a little bit more readable. And some of that's going to mean not having so much like complication of the lines, like so many detail lines. And that's kind of the final thing that I was just going to mention to you to be careful about. I know that this sort of like there's a contrast between like the creepy and the like regular sort of appealing, cute style that people go for with stylized work, and the stylized work has this really clean, smooth line work, and so if you kind of skew the other direction, it can come off creepy. But I would definitely say for especially things that you're kind of presenting as finished works, just be careful about the confidence in your lines. Something I've kind of talked about before with other critiques, but sort of doing this kind of stuff is, it's necessary at times. But when it's kind of presented as your finished work, where you've got multiple lines coming over, there's an unfinished quality to it, and it reads as a lack of confidence sometimes too. So, it's about being decisive. It's choosing the right line, right? Even if it means going over top and saying, okay, I'm going to make this one decision with my line, and that's the one I'm going to use. So hopefully that's something that's helpful for you too. And just, kind of clean up. This isn't necessarily, your most finished work or whatever. It's just a little bit of color behind a sketch, but hopefully that idea comes across. And not just obscuring details, right, with those little etching lines and stuff, because it's definitely something that can easily become a crutch if you're not careful. All right. So overall, some good stuff, I think, that will help you kind of get to that next level. Hopefully it's been helpful for you. Looking forward to seeing what you do next. I like the sort of offbeat vibe that you've got going. So I know that you've got the ability to kind of take things to the next level. Hopefully this will help you get there. Take care. Thanks a lot, Mr. Moodles. Hey there, Mr. IVANNOVICHH. How's it going? Thanks for being a patron. I noticed the things that you wanted to work on specifically had to do with your character design skills, but also you mentioned that the work that you do, or the drawing that you do, is not constructed, that you aren't really using construction in the way that you go about your work. So I think it's really interesting because you have a blend of kind of some, here the white was a little bit cranked on that layer. You have a really nice rendering style, like it comes across really well. And there's a fairly decent like level of quality that you've reached, right? In a lot of respects. And there's just it's not necessarily consistent across all of your work, but there's like, and by consistency, I mean like things are kind of in a lot of different styles. And also it's sort of like a level of it's interesting, I think, looking through over your work, because it jumps, I think. And I think, like I'm saying, there's factors and elements of your work that's really high, and then there's elements of it that are sort of keep holding it back just because they're things that you need to work on a bit. One of the things that I'm noticing, especially in your work over the last couple of months, maybe it's just a specific rut that you're in, but I think it might be a little bit indicative of the lack of construction in your work and things, and a little bit of your methodology that could benefit from being changed up a little bit. This is sort of a good cross-section of it. A lot of this is some of your recent work. Your characters the faces are not only fairly similar across all 4 of these examples, but I'm also finding that the characters themselves are posed in this sort of 3/4 view, right? They're all sort of standing this way. Pretty much. I mean, Daisy's kind of doing her own thing over here, but it's very like, it's this same angle that we're looking at our characters at, straight on, stuff like that. And a little bit of maybe what you'd call a same face syndrome. And I think it's just coming from a level of maybe comfort or a rut, or maybe just sort of plateauing because you need to incorporate a couple of things into your method, which is fine. It's good. I'll show you a couple things to do with that. So you mentioned that you don't use a constructed style, or you're not really using construction, which is interesting because you like have an awareness of it. And so I'm not sure necessarily what's keeping you from that, or if you haven't practiced much so far. One thing that I think that can help is going into your drawing with some warm-ups. This is something I'm really understanding the value of a lot more recently, which is not just jumping right into going, okay, I'm going to do an illustration of Daisy, so let me start drawing Daisy, let me do the pose right away and all that stuff, right? But when you first are getting started drawing for the day, or like in that time period, just doing some very like loose and comfortable gestures and doodles, right, and stuff like that. What I'd love to see you do, there's a couple of aspects to this to kind of improve the overall faces and the construction stuff. But this is maybe the more fun aspect of it, is to create some shapes, right? Maybe some really abnormal ones. And from that, actually add the contour lines, which is something from construction, and like kind of as you get familiar with it and everything, it'll become easier. But like a cross-section line like this, or for this shape here, like say I want to add a contour line here and here, so that you kind of get a sense of what the shape is, right? And start turning these into faces. They don't have to be realistic human faces. They can just have, eyes and mouth, some teeth like that. They can, whatever you want. This is a very, it's meant to get you kind of out of the correct face mode, which I think that you're in right now. And it's understandable if you're kind of trying to improve and you're worried about not doing things right, that you kind of get a little bit stuck, right? But this is, especially if you're kind of going into character design more, this is going to be essential, is kind of mixing up your shapes, right? So that's something I'd like to see you do, is just like fill a page with these crazy, stupid shapes, ones that shouldn't make any sense, right? Like, there's a nose going out the back of this one, and a mouth that's hanging open here. Like, just go crazy with that stuff. It'll help you to kind of loosen up, but I especially want you to be not just doing the flat shapes, but I want you to have a sense of construction to them, right? So this is not just a circle. This is a spherical bean, rounded bean shape, right? And the other thing is going to be not as necessarily as fun, but I'd like to see you rotate your objects in space more. And that's just going to be basic, cylinders and spheres that are, obviously spheres are going to look the same from every angle, but you're just going to figure out, where each of these objects, how they're laying out in space, right? Like this this cylinder is kind of graduating toward the back there. It's not a perfect one. But stuff like this, right? And turn them around in space. Because then from there, I want you to be working more on the human head, which you've got like some good like studies and sketches on your page and stuff. So there's definitely some groundwork there for you. But I want you to especially figure out the correct way. And this is not to change your work to be correct, right? It's just figuring out, okay, if I was going to draw a realistic human head, where would the proportions be? Where would things lay out? And then from there, you can say, okay, well, kind of back in my style comfort zone, this is how that looks. But I kind of want you being pulled in two different directions here, right? This is kind of one area, and this is the other, is this really wacky stuff. And it's from these two ends that you're kind of going to strike a balance between really having the fun that you should be with like lively character art and stuff, but also the right to say it, right? The right to express what you have with these realistic or correctly proportioned human characters, right? And this is just going to serve to benefit you from the standpoint of it's going to build and make this stuff more diverse, both from a style standpoint and from like a pose and angle standpoint, which is really just going to, I think is going to help you, because the place that you're at right now, you might feel a little bit restricted to keep things in this sort of 3/4 view and stuff like that. So hopefully that is helpful for you. I have some resources on my channel that kind of go further into some of this stuff, especially the looseness. But let me know if you have any questions. Looking forward to seeing where you go from here. I think kind of compounding some of these construction elements into what is already a very robust rendering process is going to just like shoot you through the roof as you practice this stuff. No rush or anything. Like, I'm not expecting it to happen overnight. Take your time, but expecting things to go really, really well for you. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Take care.